excited to just have this opportunity to share with you again and getting to kick off our Advent season together. I love Christmas time. I love everything about it. Family gatherings, the treats, Christmas lights, presents, Christmas movies, everything. It's just, I enjoy it all. And we just, in our house, we set up Christmas early and we take it down late because, I don't know, I like the lights and it's dark out at night. So it's nice to just have the lights and the brightness, right? So I'm just really happy to have a time to share. But what I get to share with you today is kicking off our Advent season is hope. And Libby came up with the theme of then and now. Hope. What does that mean? What was hope like back then? What were people waiting for when before Jesus came? What were the Jews waiting for? How do we live in hope today? What does that mean for us? And so this morning we're going to explore some of those things together. When I was thinking of this sermon, I was asking myself, what is hope? And so I had to Google it because I was like, how do you can't quantify hope. You can't hold it in your hand. Well, I have a daughter named Hope, so I can hold her. But it's not the same thing. A feeling of expectation. A feeling of trust. Faith that God will make something happen or good things happen. Those are kind of the anchor points to what hope is. Now, another great way to understand hope is to also understand its opposite, and that is despair. Now, you can ask any sports fan. They live and breathe hope and despair. Now, I am a Maple Leafs fan. And let me tell you, every April, we have a ton of hope. Actually, it rides out throughout the year. So September kicks off and we see preseason. We're like, yeah, our team has got this. Hope. And so, I mean, me as a experienced Maple Leafs fan, I know our history. But still, every year we get to April, and every year they start to tease us with like, okay, we've won one game in the playoffs, maybe we'll win a second. Let's play in that parade. And we start getting there, and then we get, we're 3 games up. We only need to win one more game. And for the last, I don't even know, 6 years, we've always lost Game 7 in the first round. Like, it's just, you feel it amongst Toronto fans, just despair. We got to tear the team down. It's garbage. Throw it apart. And so we go through this despair for a while. It takes most of the summer to get over. And then we're like, oh yeah, I like hockey, and we have a decent team. And that hope just starts rising again and again. Other people have other examples of hope and despair, but I think that encapsulates the best definition to describe it. Now, how does that look to the people of Israel? And for that, I needed to pull us back and look at the context of Israel's story, who they are, because it spans a huge length of time. So I'm going to give you a few dates here. These are just anchor points to kind of think of. Like, the time span is like beyond our capabilities to really like grasp. I mean, we think 2 years is a long time. So like when I say, the starting of Israel's story is that God promises Abraham that he will make a nation out of his descendants. That happened in 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. Now, we don't know, Abraham he was a nomadic person, so we don't have cities that he made, we don't have writings or stone tablets that he made, so it's a bit of a ballpark based on the descriptions we find in Genesis. But we know that at some point between 2000 BC and about 1700 BC, that the people of Israel end up in Egypt. And they multiply and they grow and they become enslaved by the Egyptian dynasties. And then eventually in approximately 1250 BC, they are freed, or God frees them. They didn't do it, God did it. And they wander in the desert for the time, and they start to form a nation, and then as a nation, they really aren't good at just following God's lead. And so they demand a king, and they want a king, and so in around 1050 BC, they form a kingdom. And it's great and it feels awesome for a brief period of about, 75 years. They have this kingdom that is united. And then the kingdom divides. Because the kings are not gods. They're very fallible. They're tempted by wealth and jealousy and all sorts of things and pride. And so the kingdoms divide into north and south. And that's, again, around 925 BC. And then we know in 720 BC that the northern kingdom falls to the Assyrian Empire. And then less than 200 years later, the southern kingdom falls. The temple is destroyed in 585 BC by the Babylonian Empire. Now, that just covered 1,500 years of history. So everybody caught up? Everybody know? Right? Let's put that's the biblical history, but let's put that in the context of Mesopotamian history. So Mesopotamia is modern-day Middle East. Now, this is around 1450 BC. We have a number of regions here, different nations that form empires at different periods throughout a 3,000-year period. So the Egyptian dynasties, they began in 3500 BC and went all the way to 332 BC when the Greeks conquered them. You just pause and think about that length of time. That is over 3,000 years. When the Egyptian dynasty started, woolly mammoths were still walking the planet. That's crazy. And they lasted and lasted because they were in the perfect location to be protected. Deserts on the west and south. The Mediterranean Sea on the north, so they just had to defend against ships. The Red Sea on the east, same thing. And then a small sliver of land which enemies could attack through on land. And then during this period, the Babylonian Empire has two phases. First one is between 2350 and 1595. So when God speaks to Abraham, during this period, the Babylonian Empire is reigning. And so the Babylonian Empire falls for a time, and then the Assyrian Empire rises. And they are rather strong and prominent for a long time. They eventually conquer the northern kingdom. Also during this time, wars are fought between them. The Hittite Empire. Interesting thing about the Hittite Empire. For the longest time, in the early 20th century, so we're talking, World War I, World War II, the Bible mentions the Hittites. We have no record of them in history. And so people would criticize the Bible and say, see, it's made up. They mention this Hittite people, this empire, but we don't have any records of it. And eventually, I don't know the exact date, but it's between the 50s and 60s, archaeologists eventually find this cave with writings in it, tablets in it. And then they start to discover all this material of the Hittite Empire. And why I talk to you about these things is because we have a Bible that's rooted in history. So all of the dates on the previous slide, all these nations around them are also vying for conquest, vying for power, and have it at different periods. And these are the cultures, these are the nations that are also influencing Israel. And so, as I took you through it, we saw the northern kingdom fall. Our passage today was from the book of Isaiah. So, when did Isaiah live? Can you go to the next slide, please? So Isaiah, our timeline will start at when the nation of Israel was founded, when the kingdom started. And so Isaiah is prophesying at a time when the northern kingdom has fallen. So now let's look at this people of Israel. Their hope as a nation, their hope as a people. So, they're enslaved, they're in despair by the Egyptians. They come out of that, they're wandering the desert. Again, they have this little trickle of hope, and then they're like, hey, we're stuck in a desert for 40 years. This is really crummy. Is God ever going to rescue us again? And again, despair kind of comes down. And then they get a nation, and they form a kingdom, and it keeps going up, and things look great. All of a of a sudden the kingdom divides. As a nation, they are no longer united. Brothers and sisters are divided. Tribes are divided. But they're like, it's okay. Maybe one day we will be reunited again. Maybe one king will reunite us. But then history happens. Empires rise. And the northern kingdom is conquered. And not just conquered. What happens when an empire conquers a region? One of the strategies the Assyrians did was depopulate the place. That way they can't rise up and try to attack you again. You destabilize it. And so Jews were scattered throughout the Mediterranean, or throughout the Assyrian Empire. And they're devastated. They are lost tribes all of a sudden. And so Isaiah comes and he gives this prophecy. So I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I want to just read through verses 2 and 3 again. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. When we talk about hope and despair, we often talk about darkness and light. I had an experience of this in my own life. I was on this it's kind of a leadership training program, and we went camping in Algonquin Park. And it was in September. And I remember hearing rumors that like the remnants of this hurricane was going to be pushing into Ontario, same time we were going to be camping. And so it was with like 50 students, and there was a whole bunch of leaders, and I knew only one person going. And we get into Algonquin, it's portaging and kayaking to the place that we were going to camp out. And so we get to our site, and it's starting to rain a little bit, but we kind of pop up our tent, put our bags in it, and then our site was across a little cove to where the main site was. And so we paddle across and go to it for supper. And once we basically arrived at this place, the wind started picking up, the rain started to happen. They couldn't really get a fire going, so we couldn't really eat any food. It was miserable. Like, I'm an easygoing guy, but I was just like, this sucks. But what can you do? You're stuck in Algonquin Park. It's getting dark, it's windy and rainy, you gotta just bear through it. So the leaders, they found an extra tent, and there was like, I don't know, must have been a dozen people crammed in this like 6-man tent. And we just tried to stay warm and get through the night. And I just remember, just like, it sucked. It was dark and miserable. But I remember waking up in the morning, I remember things were dry, the rain had disappeared, the wind was gone, and I just had this sense of like, light. Dawn brings a new day, new hope. We don't have to leave, we can keep going. Because I think even that some of the leaders the previous night were kind of like, maybe we gotta just cut this short, this isn't going great. But it ended up being a great trip. So let me carry on. Verse 3. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest. And we skip to verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness. From that time on and forever, the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. If you heard this as a people who had a divided kingdom, a people who had just seen the northern kingdom fall, as a people, what would you expect? As a nation, what would you be expecting? Who would you be expecting? I would be expecting a king, a king to come and rule. Somebody to unite the throne, but not only do that, rule like these empires did, have large armies, work across go across Mesopotamia, conquering and taking land, taking riches and gold, and bringing back the lost tribes. That's what I would be expecting. And so, from this point in time, around 700 BC, to the time of Jesus' birth, I mean, the Israelites lived through what I would only describe as despair. Not only did the northern kingdom fall, in 585 the southern kingdom falls. The Babylonians not only conquer it, they destroy the temple. And yes, we know that they were allowed to go back and rebuild the temple. It wasn't the same glory. It wasn't their own nation. They were still a province, at best, of the Babylonians. And then the Babylonian army falls to the Persians. And then you have the Persian Empire, another large empire that they have to pay homage to. Okay, well, time keeps going on. And then the Greeks, an even greater empire comes. Even larger, sweeping across most of Europe, all the way to India. Again, you would hear these prophecies, and what would you think? Well, that must be what God has planned for us. At some point, at some time, Daniel receives a prophecy. You have those books where at some point God's going to smash these great empires. And then again, the Greek Empire falls. It's divided into three. You have the Maccabees and the Israelites. Again, they think they have a little bit of their own independence. And the Romans come in and say, no. You got nothing. We're your rulers. We're your leader. I'm the Roman emperor. I'm the God. But we know in this time, despite everything, hope still persisted. There was a group called the Essenes. They were kind of an isolated religious group amongst the Jews. I don't know exactly when they started, but they were the group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. And one of the best preserved scrolls that we have from them is the book of Isaiah. Because they were believing, they were longing for the birth of a Savior, the birth of somebody in the line of David who would start a kingdom. Somebody who would subdue the Romans, and they would finally have their freedom. And so we come to this point. Jesus is born. And it's what we celebrate. We love it. We sing the songs. I love it. Love reading the little books to our kids of Jesus' birth. But nobody was expecting him. Not like this. I mean, look at who came to greet Jesus. Shepherds. You know who shepherds were? They were nobodies. They were the poor people. They were the ones who, were given a small amount of pay by the people who owned the land and the sheep. And yet angels came to them and said, "Go, your Savior is born. Your King is born." Wise men from the east. They didn't know God. They were following signs. Whatever their signs were telling them, but they weren't Jews. They were Gentiles. And what I love from the book, the Gospel of Luke, he has so many instances in the birth story that he's setting up to help us understand, God was painting a picture for who this king would be, for what his kingdom would be. And it turned the Jews' world upside down. But some of the people saw it. And so when Jesus, as a little baby, was brought to the temple, in Luke chapter 2, 28 to 32, there was this man named Simeon. He had been waiting there. He was an old man. And he saw Jesus, and he took him in his arms, and he praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord." I want to make sure you're reading along with me. "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light," that's hope, "for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." There it is, right there, right at the beginning. Nobody knew. Jesus couldn't talk yet. Mary and Joseph hadn't really told that many people. The shepherds had told some people, but who would have believed them? They're shepherds. And again, we have this little prophecy right in here of who Jesus is going to be. A revelation to the Gentiles. And glory for your people, Israel. There is the hope that Jesus brought. Now, what is our hope now? I worked for, this one guy I worked for when I was in university. He knew I was a Christian, and he had gone to church most of his life, and he wasn't a Christian anymore, but, he knew everything. He was raised in the church. And we would have lots of good talks, and, he always appreciated that I was respectful. And one day he asked me, he's like, are you excited to go to heaven? Are you excited about heaven? I said, sure. I was 20-something years old. I'm like, I'm not in a rush to go, but yeah, yeah, I'm excited about it. And he's just like, you're just like all those other Christians. I'm like, oh, what do you mean? He's like, well, think of it. When Jesus comes again, all those people who don't believe in him, they go to heaven. You're excited about that. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I took a step back. I was like, no. What? He's like, oh, sure you are. He's like, why would you assume that? I'm not excited about that. But I could hear in his upbringing, hear in his story of his frustration. See, I think he went to a church where often it was emphasized, the hope Jesus brought is that we are saved and we go to heaven. Hold on, we have our lives to live first because God has us here for a reason. But it taught me a lesson of I have to be careful how you frame it to non-believers in particular, of what is our hope. Yes, heaven and salvation is ultimately our hope, but that's not, when Jesus came, that's not what he told us. He didn't tell us, your hope is just you're going to heaven. Have a good life. Jesus came and he said it so many times in the Gospels that his kingdom is here. Started now. Not we're going to God's kingdom. We are part of God's kingdom now. And that's what we're called to live in. That's our hope we have now. The analogy of light, I think, goes a long way, because I think for all of us, the times we live in now, we can feel like they are dark times. I mean, people have lived through dark times throughout history. Ours is, I would say, no darker than, the Middle Ages, or times in the plagues, or World War II, or anything along huge global events. We've been through a pandemic. Hopefully, we all got through it okay. But the reality is, we sometimes got focused on what the other side was doing, what somebody else thought that was different than me, and we got caught up in being right rather than fixating on how do we actually still love people? How do we still love people? It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. How do you still love people? Because the reality is the world is filled with people that don't believe in Jesus. How do we love those people? They believe a lot of different things than we do. And we may not agree with it, but the reality is Jesus walked in a world that people believed different things. People acted and were violent, openly violent. And yet Jesus loved them. As I was thinking about this sermon, I thought of people who were trailblazers at a time, and you think of Martin Luther King. He lived in a world of segregation, but He knew the truth of God, put his life on the line, to every day just speak that truth. Not his agenda of, well, whatever. Well, to speak his truth of, like, he is a person of God. He is equal in the eyes of God, and so should be seen that way in society. It's a simple message, but one of love and the kingdom. I recently went through the Rings of Power series on Amazon Prime, and then I read the Lord of the Rings book recently as well. Huge fan of Tolkien stuff. And to me, it's stories that speak to me because Tolkien just had a way of writing, of creating a narrative and a story that was true. A reflection of the lives that I think the world we live in. And so at one point, and I think some of this is captured in the second movie, The Two Towers, but this is from the book. Sam is talking with Frodo. They're on the border of Mordor. They are in despair. How are two little hobbits still going to get all the way to the Mount Doom and destroy the ring? And Sam says, even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it will shine out the clear. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. All of us have a small part to play in God's kingdom. All of us have a small part to play in that new dawn, the world Jesus is bringing. So, as we enter this Christmas season, bring that hope with you. Bring that light with you. To your family gatherings, to your workplaces, wherever you go. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for today. Thank you for hope. Thank you that we have it. Thank you that your kingdom knows no boundaries. That you brought a way of bringing a message of love that superseded the powers of Rome, the powers of different empires come and go, but God, your message, your hope sustains us, carries us through, and we are still here 2,000 years later. Jesus, help us to share that message this Christmas season. Help us to bring light into dark places. In your name I pray.